Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining us, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Alec MacDonald. He is a journalist focused on China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He's going to talk to us about an area that is not well covered in the U.S., although it is a major issue in the Asia Pacific, which is Chinese political discourse and how that translates into information warfare abroad. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started by talking a little about your professional background and how you got drawn into this particular area of work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very much looking forward to our discussion today. And it is an area that is not well discussed or quite well understood outside of certain circles. And I think that's quite unfortunate because there's a lot of, as much as it is important to understand the disinformation, I think it is deeply fascinating to understand the cultural background of what is occurring here. And that leads a little bit into how I got started here. My grandfather was traveled to Hong Kong quite frequently, which picked up my interest in Hong Kong. I was a journalist there for about a year in 2019, and that was when there was the mass pro-democracy protests there, and basically got covered that. And following that, it quickly became untenable to be a freelance journalist there. So picked off to Taiwan, where I became a research assistant and worked in academia for about 4 years, largely studying totalitarianism and picking up on Hannah Arendt's work, as well as focusing on how does that impact the new information space that we currently live in and information warfare. So this is a bit of very much what I studied and worked on for about the past 4 to 5 years now. And I am currently a journalist focusing on these issues once again. And yeah, thank you very much for having me. I hope my research is a bit more interesting than myself, because quite honestly, I'm a bit of a dull background. So I think my research is more interesting than anything I have for me.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's perfectly fascinating. I think very few people actually know somebody close to them who travels to a completely different part of the world, and are fascinated enough by it to actually then continue researching there. I think most people tend to really stick to where they are most of the time. Um, so what specifically made you interested in information space as opposed to general politics, economy, and many of the things that people tend to focus on when it comes to Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure if it's one I've particularly contemplated much. I think it felt what was appropriate for the times,
Mm-hmm.
shall I say, is that it became clear that over there's a new rise of, so we've seen I think people have generally seen, for example, in the United States, the UK, Germany, maybe in particular in the so-called generalized West, the rise of the new right. And there's also elements of the rise of nationalism in Asia as well, and
Mm-hmm.
in particular in China, totalitarianism. And this became apparent in Hong Kong. And when I was working in Hong Kong, and the new forms of information control that are there, and the new forms of information control that China attempted to exert outwardly to shape the discourse of the protests, to shape the discourse inside other countries as well as inside Hong Kong itself. And so it became apparent to me as I was trying to figure out some of these problems from a research perspective that where is this coming from and how do we understand it in a new age? And reading Hannah Arendt and some other work of the both pre and post Second World War era, information space just kind of it naturally fit is that this is where these battles are taking place, and this is where China is attempting to exert the most control, and this is where the CCP in particular is exerting control both domestically in Hong Kong, Macau, and what they're trying to do in Taiwan, and also shape narratives globally outside of their own sphere of what they would like to be the sphere of influence, and also their own domestic audience.
Now, it's interesting when most Westerners think of China, they think of Chinese hackers. They may think of
Mm.
some very crude propaganda about Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong or things, Taiwan, things like that. They don't really think about China and information space that much. In
Mm.
that sense, they think of Russia a lot more. Why is that, and is that an accurate perception?
That's a fantastic question. And it opens a massive can of worms. I think when you think of hackers and hacking operations, they go a bit hand in hand with information warfare. Because
Mhm.
there's a part of that where these are all so let's take the a good way to understand this might be taking the most recent in the United States at least, and I think globally this has gotten a lot of coverage, is the Chinese hackers who have broken into telecom services
Mhm.
and inside the United States, the internet service providers. And this also was not only a way to gain a strategic foothold to observe traffic, to maintain a position for potential larger warfare that might come at a later date, but this will also come with certain narrative shaping opportunities. So, off the back of this, what will happen is the foreign minister and the foreign minister spokesperson in China will say that this is of course absurd that China that the United States is making these claims that we hacked their internet service providers, that we hacked their telecoms. And then the spokesperson will then have the opportunity to turn it around and say, look at everything that the US is doing, and they are being hypocrites about this. And so everything for China is this opportunity to shape the narrative and to shape the discourse. And so that is just one part of it, though. And by and large, I think that China actually outpaces Russia in this information warfare. And I think that the evidence of that is, it, I understand why somebody might push back on this because there's a little bit of the evidence that you don't see speaks to something that is not there. But I do believe that the fact that this is not discussed too much is actually evidence to the fact that they are so good at shaping the narrative very quietly. The one word that is used, or the one term that is used with China a lot compared to Russia, is gray zone activity. I
Mhm.
think one of my favorite reports on this, technical reports on this, is from ASPI about singing the praises. The title of the report, it came out in 2021 or 2022, and the report was singing the praises of the CCP. And it is about they being the CCP, are purchasing influencers to speak well of China. This is actually something that is very easily done because China is, in fact, a very beautiful country. It has a lot of natural scenery. People there are lovely, has a lot of culture that it just is, it's easy to speak well. But what the CCP does is often it takes these elements and it introduces this to say, okay, look how good, look at the interesting things here. Of course, ignore everything bad about what we do, the repression in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, Tibet, etc., our aggressive stance towards Taiwan. And then look at these elements, and then they slowly will use these influencers to uh, a bit slowly introduce you piece by piece by piece deeper into these rabbit holes, not too dissimilar to other disinformation. These rabbit holes that introduce you to, well, look how good we are compared to the United States. They don't, very similar to Russia, they don't want you to be singers of the CCP. They don't need you to be singers of the CCP's praise. They don't need you to be a communist or whatever. They just
Mm-hmm.
need you to have that doubt about supporting democracy,
Mm-hmm.
about the effectiveness of democracy, and particularly Taiwan. I think this is the most significant issue right now, is that they want to do their best to turn the narrative against Taiwan, and that is probably where efforts will go next. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but this gray zone activity of purchasing influencers, I think, is one of the most significant efforts that they make, is that they don't always come out with very aggressive, crude propaganda. Is that some of their best propaganda is very piecemeal and it's very targeted towards individual users. What the propaganda that they come out for an American and for the British are different, and it's also very different to how they target people who are of Chinese ancestry or who are from Hong Kong or who are come from immigrant families, and very aggressively, unfortunately, uh, there are cases where they very aggressively target immigrants from Hong Kong who maybe have never been there, but their parents are from there, and they'll approach them and they'll tell them that, and in person sometimes even. Particularly, this happens more in the UK and communities, and they'll tell them, "You are Chinese. You should serve the CCP. You should serve the Chinese Communist Party because you are part of us." And it's very much this, and it gets into this very cultural, almost it's vastly different propaganda because it gets into a very culture oriented of what you should serve based on your ancestry, and it can get quite distasteful actually if you get into some of the Chinese language, the way they talk about it. And the way they talk about the Han supremacy. There are many different actually language dialects and ethnicities and people groups inside China, and but there is very much this again, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is another element of it, is that there are all these different tangents and it's very efficient. I think a good way to wrap this up is that it's very efficient at targeting different segments with very quiet but very efficient propaganda to position it so it's more effective the longer you spend inside that circle.
Before we get into that, and I really want to focus on that, I want to ask you about a meta narrative here. You mentioned gray zone
Yeah.
activity, and some of that gray zone activity is not outright illegal. In addition to hacking things, which is illegal, China also purchases telecommunications networks all over the world or takes control of them through Huawei and its other mm, it's basically business side of things, and we're seeing that all over the Middle East, the telecoms in Saudi Arabia, along in standing U.S. ally, are now under control of Huawei. What is the impact
Mm.
of this telecommunications acquisition on the security of communications by US and allied countries in those areas, and on general on the general security of communications in the countries where China is actively involved?
This is certainly a very good activity. Good. This is a really good example of gray zone activity, because it is not illegal. It's not something that's purely what would be considered black hat hacking.
Mm-hmm.
It is this gray zone activity that kind of is between what is illegal and what is maybe against the, or between what is legal. So this is allowed by the laws of the country, but what might be not in the national security interest of the country that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
Not always, because sometimes these countries will be, the China will proposition these countries with, this means that you're secure, you're within our circle. So you
Mm-hmm.
will always have our back, is that we are outpacing the United States. So there is a propaganda element there, because the more influence that they can get there, the more that they can try to exhibit, we are outpacing the United States, we are outpacing the West.
Sure.
Um, it does certainly exhibit a security threat. Huawei technology, many of these companies that have telecommunication, it's simply they will have. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily true to some. What I have seen tossed around on social media, largely without evidence, that like they can simply read everything that is on these telecommunications. Um, People still need to discern that information, and if they're able to read
Mhm.
every single message on there,
Sure.
it's a lot of man hours. There's a lot of intelligence man hours just simply dedicated towards that. So I don't certainly think it poses this immediate threat, but it can. And it can pose a threat towards targeted individuals, towards individuals who might be speaking about something. And it's a bit of the unknown, whereas civilians, as a journalist, I am not entirely sure. I don't have information. I don't have access to classified information that might suggest otherwise, that these are a higher risk than what I am assuming beyond it poses a potential for a backdoor, and certainly where a backdoor could exist. For example, if somebody who was a dissident Uyghur found their way to one of these countries that
Mhm.
has this information, that has these telecommunication devices, they certainly could get caught up or get caught because China has the ability to cooperate with the security services of that country and catch them. And that cooperation we do know because we do know that they operate black sites, particularly in the Middle East, to round up dissidents. And such cooperation is real. How that is achieved, those the means and methods, we're not entirely sure about how that works, but we have ideas.
What does that mean for the security of the citizens of that country and for foreigners who are not necessarily linked to China, but who are very likely to be targets of China? Americans, British, and Japanese, and others.
Hmm. I think it depends. The threat level for every individual will change.
Hmm.
China has found many enemies in this world. Basically, anybody I think who would support democracy, who would support the sovereignty of Taiwan, who would
Hmm.
support the human rights in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. I think anybody is certainly at the threat of. I don't know. Let me back up there. Um, I'm not certain how targeted individuals would be, but I think it poses the risk that a there is no longer an assumption of security when these telecommunication devices are used. You can no longer assume that you will be safe discussing certain issues or becoming an activist on certain issues. And I think that is something that has to be kept in mind. And this gets a little bit into what China uses both certainly domestically is the idea of self-censorship. So as soon as you have that idea, the seed of doubt in your mind that the security services are a little bit tighter here, there is cooperation, there is telecommunication devices that might not be secure, even though I could be a citizen of X country, but such an atmosphere exists, even though I find myself identifying with the plight of the Uyghurs, and I would like to speak out about this.
Hmm.
I might not, I might just assume that it's not. So is this element of it may not individually target anybody, but the concept of it being in people's mind is
Hmm.
actually a turnoff to ever creating something that might be a bright spot in our quite dark world at this time. If I can get a bit melodramatic there.
So speaking back to the idea of discourse, um,
Hmm.
I think there's a, you know, sometimes people don't really understand what is they have this assumption that communist propaganda is all about economics, markets, um,
Hmm.
capitalism versus, everything else. But in reality, we see, as you mentioned, a lot of nationalist elements, a lot of elements
mm,
linked to history, and of course,
mm,
certain cultural attributes. A lot of the Americans, even American diplomats and officials going to China um for official visits, they seem to be unaware of the way the cultural communications work, and we've seen a number of faux pas in the past by various officials going there and
mm.
essentially being manipulated or otherwise falling prey to local information warfare efforts. What what should foreigners going into China for state visits or for business visits know about the way this local system works and the way communications work and the underlying priorities?
Yeah, I think there are two elements. There is a very hard security risk. And I think I'll get to that first because this is the very easy one to understand, is
Hmm.
that there have been cases where, and I think this affects academics more,
Hmm.
where this is very old spycraft. This has been around probably since humans have spied. And is you get invited into a country and they will approach you, they will treat you very, very nice and they will be very welcoming and they will basically attempt to recruit you very, very slowly, and you may not know that you're being recruited. Um, this might come as if you're a research in, let's say, I want to be very careful because I don't want to insinuate of any examples that have happened, but you study critical components for a very small part of a new airplane that the military is using. Every factor of this, every element that they might get insight to is a part of the intelligence puzzle because ultimately every part of that airplane matters. Every part of the
Hmm.
supply chain matters. So they'll slowly just try to glean intelligence from you, to talk to you about this, to get anything that might matter, and they'll treat you very nice. Now, I generally don't think that the general public, if you were to just pick up and visit China, which is actually a little bit more difficult these days, you don't necessarily have to worry about this because if you do have to worry about this, from what I understand, that the intelligence agencies, that the security clearance providers, the defense companies are all very good now about warning their employees, warning connected researchers about this now. I generally don't think this is much of a concern because if you are in such a risk, you generally know about it now. I hope you would know about it now. The more connected propaganda, and I'm sorry, we're gonna need to you're gonna need to do some editing here. What was the first part of the question that you asked?
The question is about cross-cultural communications and
Hmm,
priorities and how sometimes state foreign officials who are not really briefed well on the local protocols or whatever fall prey to manipulations, communications
mm.
manipulations.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Um, the second part of this is the what you mentioned earlier is that we kind of have this idea that that communist propaganda is very Marxian or very, like a bit of that Cold War Russian propaganda about communism and recruiting leftists and turning you into this radical leftist.
Mhm.
Well, there might be a part of that, but not really. That's something we can talk about later because that's not most people. Um, America in general is actually quite center right of most of the rest of the Western world in general. So China is not looking to return Americans into, hardcore leftist. And in fact, the China under Xi Jinping is very much a fascist state. I think you could make an argument for it being a fascist state. And while they have elements of communism in it, this is not the I think it's a little bit detrimental when certain figures in the American politique uh, try to label China as this communist. bear. I don't believe this is helpful because they're not. They're a very highly controlled, highly nationalist, highly repressive regime that targets dissidents, that does not build these functionaries like the Soviet Union did. It is Chinese communism. It's communism with Chinese characteristics, is the way that they put it. Plus, much of this has changed under Xi Jinping, with Xi Jinping now having his own Xi Jinping thought. And this is something in the leadership that when you get to a certain stage, when you're such an influential member in the Communist Party, you can have your own thought about it. The term is a slightly, um, maybe slightly Orientalist, maybe slightly like put in mystique, but it is basically you have your own section in the philosophical canon of the Chinese Communist Party. He is certainly trying to outpace Mao to the point that Mao is, well, not frowned upon outright, is no longer this great figure according to Xi Jinping's faction of the Communist Party, because when young people are working in a factory for 40 for 10, 12 hours a day, and they worked all their life to get a master's degree so far, and then they're stuck in a factory for 10 to 12 hours a day, and they're just miserable, and all of a sudden they read what Mao wrote, they realize that the China that they're living in is nowhere near this paradise that Mao promised, this workers' paradise that old communist propaganda would have taught them. So, for this reason, because Mao has moved to a little bit of a nationalist identity and embedded much of probably the extremes of what the left would call capitalism in China as this factory of the world where they export everything. Their economy runs on exports. And in fact, we can get into a little bit later, but most Chinese save a lot of their money. And there's different reasons for that. But they save most of their money, and most of the economy is driven by exports. This means that most people are working long hours in factories putting out this material. So I say all of that and I introduce all of that to say that the propaganda that China puts out, the information control that they put out, is not this hard driven communist propaganda that really doesn't exist mostly. There is some of it when it can be advantageous. Again, like I said earlier, they're very targeted. This is not what they generally put out. What they'll generally put out is especially in obtaining their regional ambitions. And I think this is the most important part is Xi Jinping is very dedicated towards claiming Taiwan. Culturally, what he would like to see himself as the next emperor of China. And by that, I do not mean that he will reinstate the imperial system. That's not what I mean. What I mean by that is he sees himself as somebody who is not only part of the CCP, but he is the CCP. He is this leader that is destined to push China forward. And particularly, his destiny is to reunite the entire kingdom. Air quotes doing a bit of the lifting of that term, but that includes, in his mind, Taiwan. And so, what the CCP will do through their foreign policy is slowly implement incremental compromises where they will use physical and active gray zone measures to slowly normalize things. They will normalize certain diplomatic, um, military, and diplomatic exercises that are not actually part of the norm, step by step by step. I think the best example of this is normalizing sorties around Taiwan's ADIZ. Even though the ADIZ is not actually, it's the Aerial Defense Identification Zone, it is not entering Taiwanese territorial airs, but it is a marker and it is a median line that they continually push past. Whereas 3 to 4 years ago, 10 planes would have been like, oh, there's a 10 fighter sortie. That's low now. And then it's not reported on at all. So it's slowly normalizing step by step because he can convince politicians and his diplomats that can convince that the diplomatic corps in China can slowly convince that these activities can be accepted as normal. And then this poses certain threats, definitely regionally, because I think that is what every propaganda has in it. Propaganda is not necessarily. I know my answer is getting long. I think the biggest difference between Russia and China is Russian propaganda is a bit mindless. It's aimed towards spewing things out and seeing what sticks to create chaos to as an element of warfare. We know that information is a actual element in Russian military doctrine. Information warfare is an element of warfare. Most other militaries do not include, or at least that I know of, this may have changed uh, over the past year, but most other militaries do not include information warfare as an element of warfare. So they have a military aim to create chaos within what they see as their enemy, is what Russia sees as their enemy. Chinese propaganda has foreign and geopolitical aims, and that is most, in my opinion, most closely connected to obtaining regional ambitions, maintaining control over Hong Kong, crushing dissent there, crushing dissent in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Macau, and in eventually trying to take Taiwan. Sorry, that was a very long answer. My apologies.
No, not at all. I think those are valid points, and I kind of want to get a little bit deeper into this sort of
Hmm.
idea of how China speaks to its own people into the other world. I think we need to kind of delve into what the quote unquote normal political discourse is, and because
Hmm.
sometimes that is hard to these sort of normal quote unquote narratives are hard to um separate from quote unquote propaganda, what is being disseminated abroad or through the newspapers. So what is
Hmm.
the norm in Chinese political discourse? How do we figure out what is a cultural um endeavor versus CCP influence?
Yeah, I think that's a very astute question. I myself have not lived in China and the Chinese mainland, so it differs from I've lived in Hong Kong and Taiwan. It actually differs there. What is considered
Mhm.
normal in the mainland is considered different. It's different in Hong Kong and Taiwan, even though I think people kind of lump those together. They're culturally different. I'm not served as a diplomat, so I might not be the best person to answer this question, but I certainly think that what is considered there are cultural differences where um, being being courteous, I think, is an important part of this. Where I'm trying to think, actually, sorry, um, of like how because I'm not sure because I've not lived in the mainland. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think about how to answer this because it's a bit not something I've necessarily encountered.
Mhm.
Um, give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute. Apologies. Uh, I just want to plug. I just need to plug a charger in. Um, while I think about this, and apologies to the editor who will have to then cut this part. Um, what is the difference between like propaganda and cultural exchange? It's such a good question, and I feel bad I don't have a great answer for you. Um, can you think of a different way to phrase it maybe that I might be able to get a little bit deeper in?
To establish a baseline for understanding what communications are basically
Hmm.
culturally Chinese and would be there regardless of who's in power, and where the CCP political influence comes in and colors this cultural baseline. Because sometimes
Hmm.
it's hard to separate, and certainly it's in the CCP's interest to conflate its own political discourse with culture, with local culture, Confucianism, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question because it's something that is certainly there. China is one of the things that's tossed around a bit is China likes to claim it's a 5,000-year-old civilization, which by and large is true. It's not continuous though. And it is, well, there is a very much a continuous, there is a line there. It is not a continuous line of the culture that is China today is not the culture of China that was 5,000 years ago. The I think one of the most interesting aspects of this is that the language has so this opens a bit of can of worms accidentally, but I'll go ahead and spend 1 minute on this. Is that the language has largely, while the way it's spoken has changed, many of the characters have stayed the same, where there is a
Hmm.
root in the deeply ancient Chinese characters of what made up the Semitic language to what the traditional characters are now. Traditional characters are used in Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, whereas simplified characters are used interchangeably inside Singapore and mainland China. And simplified took away some of the radicals that compose the written characters to allow for more people to quickly learn the language because during the Cultural Revolution in Mao Zedong's time, there was a widespread illiteracy, but my point there is to say that, and there is a debate if these simplified characters necessarily help or hurt the learning of the Chinese process, the learning of the language learning process. Um, that being said, that is an example of how the Semitic language has largely been a continuous line, and it is points to a way that this cultural monolith that the CCP likes to call China, or this their sphere of influence, um, has been its regional staying power for so long and has influenced so much of East Asia and South and parts of Southeast Asia. There are very important cultural elements that have and aside from languages, there are cultural understandings, cultural celebrations, cultural traditions that all come from what would be China. But they change depending on the people's group as people moved out and as people formed different cultures. Even though there are similarities, they're not necessarily come from what we would say China. So I think that's one way is that even though a lot of these traditions are might have similarity or similar origins, that they've changed throughout the region. So that even though China likes to claim that like what might be a cultural aspect in Vietnam is not necessarily means that it's from China. I'm not sure if I'm putting that the best, but there is a famous the kimchi incident a few years ago was one of these ways is that kimchi is a Korean dish. There are varieties of kimchi in many different Asian countries. Kimchi, though, is largely seen as something that originated in Korea. It's a cultural item they have. Some Chinese netizens attempted to claim that kimchi came from China. It is a national dish of China, and this sparked a netizen war and not a diplomatic row, but it sparked enough of an incident online that it had kind of became this comical farce where Chinese netizens and many of this propaganda was attempting to claim kimchi for China. there are other elements of this where as well where that get a bit darker, aside from claiming where certain foods come from, even though we all know that's very, very important, especially if you have visited and spent time with families here, you know how important food is. Um, the it gets a bit darker because there is definitely like cultural erasure that will happen where and I'll get and this is a good opportunity to explain what I meant earlier by the Han supremacy. And the Han people group is the majority of what makes up China. The Chinese population come from the Han people group. There are, however, many different people groups inside China. There are many different language dialects inside China. What is typically called Chinese, it's referred to in mainland China as Putonghua, standard speak. In Taiwan, it is there is certain differences in Taiwan. There's a you could say a Taiwan. There's definitely a Taiwanese accent, and there is also maybe what would say a Taiwanese dialect of some words because it is formed with the predominant language in Taiwan before 1949 of Taiyu, the Taiwanese Hokkien, before the ROC came over and established their base on Taiwan. Um, sorry, I need water. Editors can find a way to cut that. Um, where is it going there? There are many different of these different language groups, which we there are many of these different language groups, which China simply they don't while they recognize them and while they are spoken, they're not necessarily recognized in the same way where minority languages might have a spot in a more democratic society and a more pluralistic society that these very I think they're not the majority language and they're very niche in fact and these different dialects and these different peoples groups they're different cultural that they try to the CCP attempts to use this cultural propaganda to largely erase many of these subcultures and many of these sub languages that use out so that we don't necessarily know about many of them. There's a very good movie that I was shocked that came out of mainland China that I was shocked would use the Shanghainese dialect and throughout the entire movie. It is not in Mandarin Chinese, it is in the Shanghainese and Shanghai and it is I believe the name of the movie is oh I'm not gonna uh the name of the movie I want to say I'm ruling out the name of the movie before I embarrass myself. Yeah, it is not that movie. Um it's a movie that well, I wish I remembered the name. It's on Netflix. It's something about stars. Stars is in the name, and I don't remember beyond that. But it uses a regional dialect
Mhm.
that usually is not permitted in movies. It's usually just banned from movies. And this is because the CCP wants to exert a monolithic cultural dominancy over China, that they wish to institute this cultural dominancy. And they also very much so aside from where they might ban certain um, subcultures or certain languages or try to push them to a term that I think is very well known is other them, or just push them to the side and you know pretend they don't exist or try to keep them bottled up as possible where these cultures and languages and unique practices across China because it's a massive country are pushed to the side where we see on the other extreme we see for example, genocide in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. We see cultural erasure in Tibet with Tibetans, and we see it where it is not. there's this monolithic culture. Um, there are the CCP attempts to portray this monolithic culture. The other aspect that we see is, um, sorry, I'm getting tired. Um, I completely lost my train of thought. Um, oh, yeah. The other aspect that we see is this cherry picking of historical events. Unfortunately, China has a very rich history, a very fascinating history through the rise and fall of dynasties and a whole host of literature and poetry that is just absolutely beautiful. A good chunk of that is actually hosted in Taiwan in the National Palace Museum of Taiwan, from what the ROC brought to the Republic of Chinese government that picked up and moved to Taiwan, very brutally in many ways as well. But they moved many of these older cultural artifacts to the Taiwanese that is still here to, sorry, not the Taiwanese, the National Palace Museum in Taiwan that hosts many of these Chinese, what would be the Chinese artifacts throughout thousands of years of history. And the National Palace Museum in Beijing is a little bit empty, and this is the reason why. But they very much, the CCP will actually cherry pick history and reinterpret events through we call it communist, but through a series of events that calling it communist might help explain some of the ideology that is in there, but through this monolith that portrays the CCP as an inevitable force of history, where everything is a lesson for modern day that will show an aspect of CCP history through or CCP ideology through that historical event. So this is something that is also important to understand is that studying Chinese history is unfortunately as exciting and really fascinating as it is, it's slightly precarious when there are reinterpretations of it that are very much cherry picked. Uh, yeah. Oh, dear. I hope an editor can clean that up. That pushing up. Sorry, I went way off the rails. I'm gonna get a quick drink of water.
Sure, no
Sorry,
problem.
it's late here.
This is really fascinating, and I think a lot of people don't even stop to think about it. First of all, most people have know very little about the history of China beyond
Hmm.
some very generic things they learn in school. Much less what is the correct version. And quite frankly, given the battles of a history in the United States, you can imagine how much harder it is to also try to examine foreign history when you barely know your own. Um, so that gets me to the point about the narratives you were talking about, this Han dominance narrative and this appeal to diasporas on the basis of national origin. Why does any of this work? I mean, I'm sure there are some people who want to feel superior by nature of their heritage. This is why, Nazis had a good run there for a while. But
Hmm.
but not obviously not everybody would fall for that, and this generic appeal to diasporas on the basis of where the grandparents came on connected to a political party is especially troubling. I mean, I can't imagine that working for many people otherwise. If some specific political party in some country came to somebody from another country's origin, why would they automatically assume that should be a connection to that party as opposed to the
Hmm.
country in general terms? You know what I mean? In some cases, even not the country, but some village or tribe that they come from, rather than a
Hmm.
political party. So this is to me is very hard to understand.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't always work, and
Hmm.
I'm not so certain it works very well. The cases that it does work most are when you have that ideology planted enough as that
Hmm.
unfortunately one of the there's two ways that this works. Unfortunately, there is still deep rooted racism in
Sure.
parts of the West. And when people of Chinese descent experience this racism, it uh, can be very traumatic to varying degrees, and it can implant a this idea that, well, the West doesn't care about me, is that it is inherently built on racist systems. And this is very difficult to argue against because it's unfortunate that this is still a reality. And uh, the US, the West, it's not just the US, is that the West has to do better about this. And we have to look at ourselves as well and examine, okay, we just need to be better about this. Because it's very difficult when you put it in that lens. However, that still doesn't always work because when you see the way that China and the CCP and they use some of these very nationalistic terms to talk about Taiwanese, for example, and very extremely racist, what might be compared to Nazi ideology of the on the far end of nationalists is that Taiwanese are less than human, that they need to be exterminated. Most people in China disagree with that and actually like Taiwan and wish that they could travel there and don't want to, quote, stay out of politics. I'd say that's the general sentiment in China, but there is this hardcore nationalist that does treat Taiwanese, Japanese, uh, Hong Kongers very towards this very extreme nationalism. But unfortunately, so going back into talking about the diaspora and other countries, unfortunately, that is something that's very difficult to combat against. And the countries just have to be better about this and treating people equally and being, uh, particularly the United States, I think, in being what it's advertised to be through the ideas of democracy, freedom, equality for everybody, etc. US just has to be better about that if it wants to espouse these ideas.
Mhm.
Uh, the other way that it works is that these people still have family in China.
Mhm.
Is that because their family, their grandparents, their brother, their sister, their cousins are still in China, they can exert a level of, well, if you don't do this for us, if you don't do this small task to help us, it would really be sad if we start investigating your brother and lock him up. You know, if his business shuts down, what would happen if he gets visits from the police? What would happen if they found out, what if he's having an affair? You know, and implying that there'll be planted evidence. Um, and so many of these things are still very strong cultural because the public humility of losing face about your
Yeah.
family is still something that is very, very important culturally. And it's also just, I think that is something that we can understand is if we reverse that in, let's say, the country that we live in, that we're from, and we're a diaspora, we come from a diaspora where we still have family elsewhere in that country. I think it's quite understandable the intense decision that you have to make is that am I gonna help carry out this maybe small insequential act of espionage against my country because my family is at risk?
Mhm.
It's that is, I think, the most effective way that it works. Most other times it falls on deaf ears, or unfortunately there is a countries, the United States, democracies fail to be democratic and show equality. But the most effective way, unfortunately, is that coercion on a level that is, I think, very difficult to understand until one experiences. And I hope most of us never have to experience with what that would be like.
It's basically family-related blackmail, extortion, or of that sort. Using
Oh,
families as leverage to force people into compliance. And because it's a foreign country, there's, the only thing you can do is, go to the police and, get an order of protection and get those people expelled. But it doesn't guarantee that your family won't be harassed at the end of the day.
yeah, exactly. It would be um, because police internationally just don't have a there's
Jurisdiction.
nothing the international community can do. There's nothing. Um, yeah, generally there's nothing that can be done, and you just have to make the moral decision that you'd land upon. And I think, or you just try to get your family out as soon as possible, and you
Mhm.
just try to lay low. And yeah, it's very, very difficult. That this leverage, this active leverage, unfortunately, is very difficult. And I don't think it happens too often. But when it does happen, it's absolutely terrifying. And I think this speaks to the need to crack down on the overseas spy rings and these black sites and these people who do. I know the New York Federal Court, the Department of Justice in the United States has released indictments of intelligence operators, call them what they are, who attempt to carry this out against Chinese diaspora who tried to leverage people by threatening families that your relatives back in China will face punishment if you do not cooperate with us. There have been actual indictments about that.
Mhm.
Um, and in the one case that I recall, the man he did not cooperate with him. I don't know what happened to his family, but these agents of China of the CCP were caught and indicted and brought to justice in New York.
That's good. I think the only real way to crack down on it is to hold accountable not only the specific individuals, but maybe impose sanctions against anyone connected
Mm,
to that on a higher level, and maybe, kind of discourage that if you engage in that sort of pressure against, citizens living in our country, you don't get to travel here, you don't get to do business
yeah,
here, you
yeah,
don't get. So that could be an effective leverage point by the international community. But that brings me to the point of the fact that this systemic manipulation of language, of history, of narratives is pervasive, and precisely because it's less subtle, it's more likely to be effective. Now, you mentioned economic issues. And
mm,
quite frankly, a lot of the stability of the CCP was based in being able to provide for the countries when there is a economic upheavals, or uh you know Xi Jinpingism is taking China is a much more isolationist direction, which is also having a sort of impact on some levels, not on everything. That can lead to questions among people who otherwise would be happy to go along to get along. And you mentioned that a lot of people are saving a huge amount of their money. So how does that all play into this concept of trying to maintain control while also pursuing other foreign and domestic agendas?
yeah. So I think in modern Chinese history, and by that I'll say since the founding of the People's Republic of China after 1949,
Hmm.
is that there are several stages, and we don't necessarily have the time because I've certainly talked everybody's ear off already. We don't have the time to get through all of those, but um, there was the building up stage, where generally after 1949 and into the Cultural Revolution, there was the Cultural Revolutionaries, and there's everybody else. There's widespread devastation to the point that people simply could not bother to care about anything other than where they will get their next meal from because of, we know, mass starvation. And this massive upheaval of internal economic pressures that coming from the war, from almost 2 decades of warfare in China at that point, since Japan invaded before what would be the start of the Second World War, according to some. We put that at the Marco Polo Bridge incident. That continuous stage of warfare and that devastation, most people simply couldn't be bothered to care that much what happened at a national level because they just needed another meal. So we had that stage, the rebuilding of China, and then into that where we get this cultural revolution and we get this very much this control of thought, and we get this idea where no longer of you do not no longer get to create anything new. You're subservient to this new totalitarian regime where you must obey its cultural edicts, where you must obey its ideology. And this is something that is a sticking power throughout all of throughout the rest of up to today. And then as China modernizes, as it opens up to the rest of the world, and as the United States flips diplomatic recognition from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China, thus opening up China, giving it a seat at the United Nations, and what is called what the US has agreed to with the One China principle. This allowed China to modernize its economy and start slowly internally building through different economic models, through simply infrastructure, through building up through what many countries went through at that point in the 70s and 80s of mass rapid industrialization and urbanization. These pressures led up to the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. Is that because of these rapid economic growth, there is suddenly a very much an open divide economically, and new economic pressures and dissatisfaction that people now had meals, people could care, people had the ability to study and read and to understand that there is a new level of control that they did not want anymore, that they were pushing for more open, transparent government, where they were pushing for reforms of the CCP to live up to its promises, to open up to different party leadership, to modernize its party system, and to not push for these very strict controls on the form of economic. And by that, I don't necessarily even mean communist, what would be referred to as communism per se, even though it is very centrally controlled, but using that central control to basically run forms of highly structured capitalism that make them not necessarily free market. It's a bit difficult to understand, and I'm not the best at explaining this economically, but these strict structures of control that force people and that created economic divisions within 1989 China led to were part of what led to the Tiananmen massacre and the mass protest, and then ultimately the massacre. Slowly after that, into the 1990s and up to today, we begin to see China turning into the factory of the world, or what people see it as the factory of the world, where they're creating things and exporting on mass scales and supplying and becoming a key supply chain to many parts of the world, to the entire world. This has led into where there's a point where in 2013, where the Chinese presidency was coming between Xi Jinping and now a very little known figure, Li Keqiang. Li Keqiang probably should have been the president of China. He was a reformist who many thought would become the president. Well, he would not be democratic by any means. He was pushing for more open market reform. This open market might be something to what we see in Vietnam, where Vietnam is still a socialist country, but their economy is very capitalistic. But there is still some forms of central control. He also came up with the Li Keqiang index. That is probably a better way to understand how satisfied people are domestically by how many trains are moving internally, how many goods are moving internally, and many of these internal factors that show the health of the economy that are not necessarily put upon GDP or other traditional economic factors about the movement of people and the movement of goods. So just by explaining this index slightly and some of Li Keqiang's core theories, we understand that there's this very stark difference to what Xi Jinping has turned the CCP into. And this is not to say that Li Keqiang would have been some great democratic reformist. I don't think so, but it would be a dramatically different People's Republic of China and CCP if he had become president. Would they still be aggressive and not friendly? Yes, those factions have always been there, but it'd be very, very different. Instead, what Xi Jinping has done is he's basically taken the worst of communism, the worst of capitalism, and the worst of many of these other things to create this neo-totalitarian state that controls information, that pushes people into factories because he refuses to see, and his faction refuse to see any other way to grow economically other than export. Domestic spending has been since 2020, and the pandemic has exacerbated this. Domestic spending is non-existent, or I shouldn't say non-existent and be hyperbolic, but it's just not rising. It is China. It does not domestically consume things. Maybe in the big cities there's a bit more, but in most Chinese cities there's just the savings continually rise. There is this economic imbalance has given rise to concerns about passing stimulus bills, because stimulus bills, even though that might incentivize domestic and internal spending, it would lead to a potential debt crisis. So the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, has attempted to say things to encourage to use local political parties at the county level to spend more on infrastructure, to spend more on housing, to build more things, to incentivize the growth of the economy. This, however, does not work because you can only build so many things. You can only build housing and do infrastructure projects so many times before they just become empty lots and this is what has led to much of the crisis economically throughout Xi Jinping's time. And there's just unfinished housing because so many construction companies have just not finished these projects because of financial difficulties on loans that they should never have received in the first place. Um, so this has led to very much internal dissatisfaction because people don't know what the state of the economy is. People don't trust that the CCP is moving and that their government is moving in the right direction, that they feel very stressed economically. Whereas in other parts of the world, there is inflation, there is deflation inside China. So this has led to the incidents of where in the world where we're looking in the next 4 years with Donald Trump becoming president of the United States and applying tariffs, and China may no longer being able to export things as much. This might force the hand of Chinese policymakers inside the PBOC to finally release stimulus because they have no other choice but then to start selling things back internally into the economy.
You earlier mentioned something called the lay flat movement and the right foot dumpling cycling. What is that and what does it have to do with all of this?
Yeah, so this is a great question. The lie flat movement started about 2 years ago and it has slowly grown into something more, is because if you if you're young and you are currently in your 20s and you have dreams of becoming an academic, of becoming the white collar worker, of inventing and creating and being an entrepreneur, doing all these things that are very natural for humans to want to do, creating things. You go and you get and in some ways, this is not very much different than the rest of the world. You go to a high ranking university, you get a bachelor's, you go get your master's. And then this should give you invest so much into education at high levels. The cat is now joining the meeting, by the way. Um,
I've been watching
and
the shadow in the back.
yeah, is that you work so hard to get your master's degree. And then what happens is that you're then told that, sorry, we have no jobs for you. You must go work in a factory because our economic model is to export.
Sure.
So this is the lay flat movement where there is no hope. The future, even if you work really hard to get a master's by 24 or 25, your future is laying flat and working 12, 10, 12 hours a day. So this is where people and young people in particular have just chosen to literally lay flat, take pictures of themselves, post it on social media of them laying flat. This has turned into the apocalyptic graduation photos, where your graduation photos are melancholy, you're sad. Instead of happy graduation photos, you take dramatic and melodramatic pictures of yourself, or you take pictures and Photoshop the world burning around you. All these very melodramatic things that young people like to do. This is what it is. It's because there's not really a brilliant future inside Xi Jinping's China for many of these young people who have worked so hard to achieve more. They just get told, no, you sorry, go work in a factory because that's your future, or go work 10 to 12 hours a day because that is the future that this economic model is pushing for. Um, and it's just led to a crackdown on many different forms of life. Where last month, while this was not certainly connected to anything political, there's just a bunch of students who like hundreds who just decided to cycle across a big city in China, Chengdu, to go get dumplings. They just all cycled for it, hundreds, and uh, you could say it was not a political movement. There's no political statement behind it, but it was born out of this where there's no fun allowed in China anymore. Where you have to, Xi Jinping has instituted such structural forms of controls that your entire life is for serving the party and being a patriot for the party and living very grueling life for the party, where there is no creativity anymore. So these are some of the different things, that challenges that young people are facing there, that is just making them see that there is really there's no hope, there's no bright spot for them in the future, that this you know it's not necessarily anything about the state of communism or anything like that. It's just that there's just no hope or no vision for the future.
That's, do you think that has a, so on the one hand you have these, little small acts of I guess self-expression, mass self-expression. On the other hand, you have this extremely stringent um social credit system, which in itself is a form of control. It's certainly
Yeah.
almost an informational control, because it informs the government about everything you do, every little transgression. And on the other hand, it creates this robotic conformist system where people are, answer to this, to this Borg. So how do these little acts of self-expression fit into that structure?
Well, it creates this incentive that uh, it's you must serve as a patriot to the to China, and by to China I mean to the CCP. And anything outside of that, and any expression outside of that, means that you're not ideal, and eventually it to the point that you are no longer considered Chinese citizen. I think even though there's no social credit score system in Hong Kong, the easiest way to understand this system of idea, that this concept, is to understand that what they're pushing for in Hong Kong is this structure of control where you must be a servant to the future of Hong Kong under China, of China Hong Kong. There is no longer any separate Hong Kong culture. There is no longer any separate Cantonese Hong Kong culture. And so if you do not serve for the betterment of being a patriot, then you are no longer a citizen. Then you no longer are Chinese. Then you no longer are worthy to be all these different things. And there's very much uh, this idea that if you are no longer good enough if you do not obey every all these little steps, and that means you don't get to access, and that concept inside mainland China is taken where if you do not conform to all these little acts, every little act of dissidence means that you don't get access to certain um, you would not be considered for certain uh, advancements. You not be considered for certain career postings. You would not be considered that you might get more interest from the police. Your social media might get flagged for more scrutiny. Where if this was certainly used at times of great disagreement with the CCP, where people were posting on Weibo or other social medias inside China that the United States government is so bad, they are so corrupt, we really dislike the United States government. But what they meant by the United States government was their own government. They're getting around censorship by criticizing their government, but anything that they criticize their government for, they just wrote the US government instead.
Hmm.
On one particular night, I think if I recall correctly, during COVID, during the very, very strict lockdowns, I think in 2023, in Shanghai, it grew to the point that the term the United States government, or a term similar to this, was censored on social media because they're using this term. Netizens were using this term so much to describe their own government. And it kind of shows these creative ways to get around censorship and to kind of express oneself more. Um, but it's all this, it's very much like you might get your social media watched, if you continue to do this. And this might mean that every little action or every little interaction will get watched more closely. Because things that might be considered normal in the West, like LGBTQ representation of of your interest of showing like your family heritage or culture, like where you come from culturally, if you come from if you come from an indigenous background and indigenous heritage, where these certain forms of plurality might be more celebrated in the West or accepted, where we generally see diversity and pluralism as a good thing in advancing democracy. uh, these are not allowed. These expressions are not allowed inside China, is because they go against this very structural model of what it means to be a patriot.
Hmm. And do you think some of these systems are going to be exported to Hong Kong and elsewhere where China has influence eventually?
Uh, Hong Kong maybe after 2047, after it loses its status as a special administrative region. I don't think it'll get exported anywhere else, though, that they do not have direct
Mm-hmm.
administrative control over. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, of course, I think we'd see if they take Taiwan, I think we'd see very extreme forms of this to the degrees that we have never seen before. I think we'd see very horrific things in Taiwan, and that's why it's so important to protect the sovereignty of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I don't believe that there will be any exporting of this technology to regions that they do not have direct control of.
Mm-hmm.
Although I should say we do see unique forms of this in Xinjiang and the Xinjiang Special Administrative Region, where there are tighter forms of control compared to maybe a Shanghai, which still has some slightly more, because it is still considered a slightly more outward looking city. You
Sure.
might have a little bit more leeway there, whereas in Xinjiang, you by default of being a Uyghur, you are considered suspicious by just the fact of who you are.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen some of the propaganda abroad with the Iranians and others, foreigners coming in and claiming that, oh, look, I'm going to the mosque in Xinjiang, and or here are people doing regular normal things and so forth. So there is this propaganda image being exported to the regular public. I think the CCP is aware of the image it projects abroad, and even though internally it's kind of has control, it also wants to control its image abroad, even though at the same time
Hmm.
they claim that they don't. really care about the US and others, right?
Yeah, they definitely want to control their image abroad. This is very much a goal, and it goes back a little bit about what I was saying at the beginning that they will slow. This is a great example, using influencers to control the
Hmm.
image, so that there is this very well. China is not that bad, therefore, why do we care about Taiwan? Why do we have to defend Taiwan? Well, aren't our all Taiwanese these horrible nationalists? And it's this slow like, oh, China's not that bad. You see Xinjiang, not bad. See Hong Kong, it's like this. They're using these influencers to kind of slowly manipulate the information space and the outward facing image. Um, Again, there's a reason for this, and it's because they want to obtain regional and larger geopolitical aims, and having controlling their image um, does not necessarily mean they want you to become uh, a praise the CCP and everything about it. It just means that they want you to believe it's just okay enough. We do not need to resist it,
Hmm.
and that Taiwan is not important, and protecting democracy in Hong Kong is not important. Protecting human rights in Xinjiang is not important, so that they can obtain regional goals that are largely unresisted.
Hmm. So the issue is not that they really um the issue is that they don't want interference, basically. They just want to continue to be able to do what they want. But they are cognizant of the public image, but is it because, but at the same time, they're restricting tourism from the West. So it's not that they really
Hmm.
care so much what the West thinks. It's basically just about eliminating obstacles and sanctions and things like that. Is it really more about the political level than the popular image?
I believe I do think there is a public image there to element to it,
Mm-hmm.
is that there might be that, but I do believe that it's more of a political goal, that there is a very direct political goal. And in some terms, I believe that makes it more, excuse me. And in some terms, I believe that makes it more dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
is because of that it has a political goal behind it. It is thus more dangerous because it is curated to aim towards some end. It is curated to um, influence in some way that they can gain a strategic importance. And then they don't necessarily care about you that much after that, after they're able to obtain and maintain their strategic importance or their strategic goal.
So, the final question to wrap all of this up and kind of tie it together. Do you think they are more successful now, or do you think people are waking up to what's actually going on and there's more external resistance? How would you rate the influence of this information warfare, in terms of the general dynamic and direction?
Uh, I believe they're more successful than they ever have been. And I believe people are not waking up to it. I believe there is attention being drawn to it. I believe that there are people who are more aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is more. I think more people know about Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Tibet. Well, actually, I'm not convinced about Tibet because that used to be a very celebrities. To maybe age myself or show I'm a little bit younger, is that this is a bit before I was old enough to really recognize some of these issues. But celebrities used to speak out about Tibet quite openly
Mm-hmm.
and and discuss these issues, and now they're not. In 2019, Taylor Swift held a concert in China. I think in the 90s, this is not, I don't think this is something that she would have done. I believe she may have spoken out instead about Hong Kong and said, no, I'm not going to host a concert there. No, I won't do this. And I will value, and I'll put more emphasis about human rights and standing up for obligations and treaties that were signed
Mm-hmm.
instead. But instead, it's just become a factor of, well, money and audience. and an influence is that if you speak out against China, you then become somebody who must, you know, if you speak out against them as a celebrity, they will make sure that your reputation is tarnished, that you will lose followers inside the country, is that and that they will try to tarnish your reputation elsewhere. And you'll just lose access to a lot of money. And for some people, that's just more important. That is their decision at the end of the day. And so I think it is more, and I don't want to pick on Taylor Swift and get all of her fans. Yeah, I listen to her music, and get all of her fans mad at me, but it's just a very pertinent example, I think, to like, well, these issues are almost put like when we talk about them, it's like we talk about them as they're very gravely serious issues, and then we get up, leave for 5 minutes, and are like, I do like money. I do like the normal flow of things. I do like the way things are. Maybe we can put off these issues and just continue living. And um, I think eventually, when it comes to Taiwan, people are going to find that this strategy of just being able to ignore issues, trying to push things diplomatically down the road, is going to have very traumatic and tragic consequences that will wake people up very quickly, but it'll be too late, I think, if we wait or if we wait for that to happen.
I'm not convinced that things will end with Taiwan given China's political and military activity in the general South China Sea area with other countries. I think, given that it has ongoing territorial disputes with a whole group of its neighbors, it can
Mm,
proceed much further. But speaking of Taiwan, the one
yes.
thing that I wanted um to kind of bring back to is that China, of course, tried to avoid a military confrontation by meddling politically. And we have seen that in the past elections. We have seen enormous amounts of disinformation and propaganda that ultimately did not succeed. But the one interesting thing that very few people were talking about is beyond the usual disinfo. China has attempted to create alternative parties to split the votes and to bring mainstream candidates into its fold through subtle means. Do you think this is an approach that they can succeed with in the future, whether in Taiwan or in other places where they want to wield influence?
Uh, yes, I do think it is a strategy that they could use. Inside Taiwan, no. And I need another hour to explain why. But no, I don't think that is something that they can use in Taiwan because um, it is something that the political system in Taiwan currently does not necessarily allow.
Mm-hmm.
It allows for it, but the candidates and the people who would be most splitting are really, really bad politically. The KMT candidate this time around, Hoyoi, was deeply unpopular, and uh, while there was some voting, he didn't do horribly. It wasn't really a close race at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Kawan is the third party candidate who may, in my opinion, may have been more pro China than Huo Yi, the KMT candidate, is currently sitting and being held incommunicado in prison for corruption. There are Terry Guo, the other candidate, was so incompetent in running his presidential campaign. He was a KMT candidate who deeply nationalist, who he was upset that he did not get nominated, so he ran off and ran on his own, and eventually ran a campaign so poor he had his his spokesperson quit and write a letter to the media saying, "Please don't elect Terry Guo." And then he elected somebody for his vice presidency who probably, they if their ticket had even made it to the ballot, it didn't. That she would have been her citizenship status. So well, there are certainly other dynamics in Taiwan that I do feel are dangerous, and I need so much more time to explain those. This past showing of the pro-China candidates was, or the candidates who would have been beneficial for China to have, because I don't
Sure.
believe there's necessarily any openly pro-China candidate unless it's Ma Ying-jeou rising back to become the president once again, which I don't believe he could. Um, that um, it's just they're not very savvy politically right now. But I need more time to explain why.
Well, thank you so much, and I definitely do want to have that separate conversation about Taiwan politics because that too, I think, to most people is a complete mystery for obvious reasons. Even U.S. politics is a complete mystery, including to those who are running.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
much less Taiwan. But I think this was a great. I think it was an important glimpse into a complicated strategy that I think is all encompassing. It's huge because Chinese Chinese influence is very significant, and I think it's underestimating it is it comes with huge risks and costs. And
Mm,
I think part of the awareness is to be educated about what they employ and how they approach people, and the fact that it's just because it's not really in your face like some of the um, pro-Russian narratives that we are seeing doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own successes. Um,
mm.
and so thank you so much for joining us. For those watching us, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. And with us was Alec MacDonald, who's shed great insights into Beijing's information space battles and the way it is subtly but steadily manipulating discourse at home and abroad.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Thank you.